You remember that terrible film that came out in 2010 called Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief? Yeah, I won't be talking about that yet, but I will be talking about the book series it's based on. Sadly, I have to use clips from the movie, so bear with me. With that out of the way, let's begin. I finally remember reading the Percy Jackson series in middle school, and to this day, I have a certain fondness for it. From that time, the series has developed a fervent fan base, and for good reason. What's not to love about a YA series based on Greek mythology? However, I started questioning these thoughts. How many things do you like when you're like 12 and still end up liking years later? So I did what any sensible person would do with their free time. I reread the series to answer one question. Is Percy Jackson worth the hype? One of the first things I realized when I picked up Percy Jackson again was just how targeted to a specific audience this series is. The language is too simple for me at this point, the jokes too reminiscent of middle school humor, and the themes are not as mature compared to what I read now. The point is that I had to make a conscious effort to put this series into context and engage with it a bit more differently than I usually would. Let's try that right now. There really is no getting around the fact that Rick Riordan had a younger audience in mind when writing the Percy Jackson series. Thus, all the choices he made were to create a story that introduces Greek mythology to kids. A lot of the darker elements, Greek myths, are excised from the story, and while there are monsters, for instance, they don't even bleed, they just turn into fine golden dust when killed. We exclusively follow the main character, Percy Jackson, who was 12 in book 1. Combine that with the fact that all 5 books are written as a first-person narrative, and it's easy to excuse all the rather childish elements. That said, I still enjoyed a lot of what the series offered. I just think the reading experience is better at a younger age. As I mentioned earlier, Rick Riordan utilizes Greek mythology as a foundational element of the world he built in this. The Greek gods from all the old myths are alive and well in the Percy Jackson universe. They reside at the top of the Empire State Building. That also means that all the monsters and various mythic creatures are also alive. This is where I had to give it to Riordan because he really did his research. The amount of monsters and Greek myths he references in the story is astounding. Not only the popular ones like the Minotaur, the very first monster we are introduced to in The Lightning Thief, Medusa, Cyclopses, Cerberus, but also less well-known ones. But Riordan takes the extra step of bringing these monsters into the modern setting of New York in a way that adds a different twist to these Greek elements. A great example of this is the Lotus Hotel from The Lightning Thief. It's a reference to the Lotus Eaters that Odysseus and his crew comes across on an island. The people of the island offer them the lotus flower, which makes some in Odysseus' crew forget all about going home. Some people might call this lazy storytelling, but I think Riordan gives himself enough artistic license so that he isn't totally constrained to being 100% in line with the myths. An example of this is the Mist. In Percy Jackson, the Mist is a supernatural force that obscures gods, monsters, and other mythical phenomena from mortals. A similar force exists in the Homeric epics. In some instances, a hero, deity, or an inanimate object is hidden from mortal eyes by a substance that loosely translates to gloom or mist. But it's not as all-encompassing as Riordan's Mist because it doesn't strictly hide the supernatural. Look no further than the Odyssey again, where Athena hides the island of Ithaca in mist so that Odysseus would not recognize it. So why stretch this bit of mythology? Because it fills a massive hole in the world building. How would you explain a camp full of demigods in Long Island Sound, monsters of all shapes and sizes, magic, and Mount Olympus being on top of the fucking Empire State Building? It's not an exaggeration to say that the Mist is the most integral part of the Percy Jackson universe, and that's why it's explained very early in the series. Now that we went over the general world-building elements of the Percy Jackson universe, we need to talk about how that relates to the structure of the story. In general, the series itself is fairly formulaic, and each book, especially the first three, is patterned like the Greek myths with a huge adventure where the heroes are trying to get from point A to point B, but they get sidetracked by monsters or other side quests along the way. Don't believe me? Let's casually compare the quests in Book 1 to the stories of the Greek heroes. First, let's talk about Prophecies. Like most Greek myths, the quest to find the Master Ball involves a prophecy from the Oracle of Delphi. You shall go west and face the god who has turned. You shall find what was stolen and see it safely returned. You shall be betrayed by one who calls you a friend, and you shall fail to save what matters most in the end. Totally nonsensical, with the potential to have various interpretations, but just enough clues to make you come up with the wrong conclusions. That, my friends, is a well-written prophecy. You, along with the main characters, think the prophecy is clear until the very end, where it's revealed how it actually unfolds. It always makes sense at the end. That is hard to do when prophecies are basically spoilers. But the difference is that all the prophecies we get in Percy Jackson are related to the quests. You can't go on a quest without consulting the Oracle. But in Greek mythology, it's not so clear-cut. Take the story of Perseus. The Oracle warns Acrisius, king of Argos, that his own grandson would kill him one day. And we know how that ended. Next, Journey to the Underworld. To find out what happened to the Master Bolt, Percy, Annabeth, and Grover must travel to Los Angeles, the entrance to the Underworld, to confront Hades. They think this is the last stop in their journey, but they find out that no, Hades is not a bad guy, and he did not steal the Master Ball. Similarly, a trek to the Underworld is one that many heroes in Greek mythology attempt. Let's see, there's Hercules, who goes to the Underworld to borrow Cerberus for his 12 labors. Orpheus goes to rescue his beloved wife. Odysseus ventures into the Underworld to speak to the wise man Tesseri. I'm going to just put it on the screen right there. You get the picture. Monsters. Oh, so many monsters. Percy and the gang come across various monsters on their quest. They wander into Medusa's lair and barely escape with their lives. Then they bump into Hecna, the mother of monsters, at the Gateway Arc, and her pet, Chimera. Percy almost dies from the Chimera poison stinger, by the way, so yeah. Finally, in Los Angeles, they run into a mattress store owned by, you guessed it, Procrustes. You know, the guy that coaxes his travelers to lay on his beds and then stretches them out until they fit. I know it's fucking weird. Don't think about it too long. Similarly, Hercules had to face the Nemean lion, the Hydra, the Stamphilian birds, the Erymanthian boar, and so on. Perseus killed Medusa and the huge sea monster. Theseus famously slew the Minotaur, and Odysseus encountered Polyphemus and other giants, the Sirens, Scylla, and Charybdis. Man, Odysseus was really down bad, huh? The point is, man, there are a lot of monsters. Divine Aid. Before the quest starts, Percy gets his magical sword.
It's a powerful weapon. Guard it well.
AKA Riptide, because I can't pronounce the actual name.
This is a pen.
It has two special abilities. One, it's a pen that can turn into a sword, and two, it can't be lost. Like ever. I just had to mention the sword because it's
cool.
Besides Riptide, Percy gets 3 pearls from his father when he jumps into the Mississippi River because of the poison I mentioned a few minutes ago. Percy uses the pearls to help the trio escape the Underworld. Anyways, they wash up on the beach of Santa Monica and continue on their journey. Likewise, ancient Greek heroes always received a lot of divine aid in the form of trinkets or other stuff. The most obvious that comes to mind is Perseus, again, who was gifted Hermes' winged sandals, a bronze shield from Athena that's polished like a mirror, a sword from Zeus, the helm of darkness from Hades, and a knapsack to put Medusa's head in. However, in a lot of other cases, divine aid does not come in the form of objects, but rather direct intervention from the gods. Throughout the Odyssey, Odysseus is guided by Athena several times, and she usually takes different forms in these encounters. This is all to say that Riordan built a world that is still intriguing to me today, but it's not as fascinating compared to when I first read the series. So you might be asking, okay, world building is great, but what else is good about this series? Well, I'm glad you asked, because I think without this particular thing, this series would not be the same. And that thing is compelling characters. But before we get into that, here's a message from today's sponsor.
Remember when you were making out with your first girlfriend, and you came right as she touched your leg? It was me, Barry. I jerked you off at super speed so it'd seem like you nutted at just a woman's touch.
Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you are enjoying this so far. So let's get into the characters. We're not going to get into all of them, just like the main ones. So Percy, obviously. As I said before, the book series is written in first person. We'll begin with Percy, the main character. So he's like 12 when the books start. He's impulsive, he makes bad jokes, and is anxious all the time. He starts out as an ordinary kid that struggles with dyslexia, ADHD, and getting into trouble. This gets him kicked out of every school he attends, and on top of that, he has an abusive stepfather who does not get along with his mom. His mom is probably the only person in the world he cares about, and maybe his friend Grover, but, basically his life sucks. He feels useless with nothing to look forward to in life. Then he winds up in Camp Half-Blood, and he is told that he's a demigod, meaning that his father is not actually dead. He's Poseidon. And the ADHD and the dyslexia are normal conditions amongst the demigods, and it helps them in battle. Throughout all 5 books, Percy is still intriguing and a fun character to follow. Next, Annabeth Chase. Daughter of Athena, she ran away when she was 7. And she thought that her family didn't love her for a very long time. She eventually ran into Thyla Grace and Luke Castellan. They took her in and, they fought monsters as they made their way to Camp Half-Blood. Things go terribly wrong, and Thyla gets turned into a tree fending off the monsters chasing after them. It's a very traumatic experience for Annabeth, and Grover forever blames himself for it. And it's kind of like the arc that he goes on where, he has to overcome his insecurities, but back to Annabeth. Because she's been at Camp Half-Blood longer than most, she's very experienced and knows everything there is to know about this world. She's also smart, resourceful, and a loyal friend. Her relationship with her father is something that we see progress throughout this series, and at first it's strained, but then in the end it slowly starts growing. Her relationship with Luke is also interesting. She kind of has a crush on him, and then she's like the only person that holds out hope that, he redeems himself. Speaking about Luke is the son of Hermes, and he's an antagonist in the series. In the first book, he's revealed to be the lightning thief, and he's like working to resurrect Kronos to bring the downfall of Olympus. Luke's backstory is tragic, like most demigods in this universe. He spent most of his life not knowing his father, and his mother was mentally unstable after trying to host the oracle that was cursed by Hades. It's a long story. Luke runs away from home at the age of 9, partly because he was afraid of his mother's freaking fits. It's really depressing stuff. For 2 years or so, he was alone until he found Thyla. It's implied that Luke also had a crush on her, so losing her really affected him. He developed bitterness towards Hermes and all the other gods. Kronos shows up in his dreams and convinces him, hey, the gods are nothing, come with me. In the end, however, Luke is revealed to be the true hero of the prophecy, sacrifices himself by stabbing himself in the stomach with Annabeth's dagger, and then, in the process, saving Olympus from destruction. And he's the most complex villain in the world? No, not by a long mile. But he has nuance, and you begin to understand his motivations. He wants life for demigods to be better, and he really wants to protect the people that he loves, particularly Annabeth and Thyla. The only way to achieve that, in his mind, is to destroy Olympus and side with Kronos. And his tribal actions in this pursuit are always painted as wrong, but it's never just him being angry at the gods. And then Luke is also a foil to Percy, so that adds a bit of a dynamic to the two. So now, with all of that out of the way, because that was mostly positive, glowing stuff, now let's get to the critiques that I have of this series. While I praise the way that Riordan takes Greek mythology and puts it in a modern setting, there is one aspect of that just did not sit right with me, and that was the way he explained how the Greek gods came to rule in the United States. Basically, the Greek gods embody Western civilization, and the most powerful Western nation at any given time is where they move to. First, it was Greece, then Rome. Whenever the flame was brightest, the gods were there. They spent several centuries in England. All you need to do is look at the architecture. People do not forget the gods. Every place they've ruled for the last 3,000 years, you can see them in painting, in statues, on the most important building. So what is wrong with this? It's a pretty reasonable explanation on the surface. Bear with me here. The idea that the gods are with us because we are the most powerful nation in the world that carries the torch of Western civilization just smacks of American exceptionalism and other similar ideas, you know what I mean? Maybe if it was just the previous quote above, I wouldn't have had an issue with it, but it just appears repeatedly in the series. The most eye-raising part comes in The Last Olympian, the last book, where Percy meets Dionysus. Dionysus warns him that if the demigods lose Olympus, it would literally be the end of Western civilization. If Olympus falls, not only will the gods fade, but everything that is connected to our legacy will also begin to unravel. The very fabric of your puny civilization. Art, law, wine tasting, music, video games, silk shirts, black velvet paintings, all the things that make life worth living. Dionysus is really being hyperbolic here, right? Yes, your entire society will dissolve, perhaps not right away, but mark my words, the chaos of the Titans will mean the end of Western civilization. Are you beginning to see the issue here? I think this was supposed to raise the stakes, but all it did for me was simplify the clash between, Kronos and the gods. Guys, we have to save Olympus because, the whole world is going to be plunged into chaos and we will no longer remember what it's like to have wine and silk shirts. Think of the silk shirts.
Yeah!
To be fair, in the end, Percy Jackson tries to get the gods to reckon with how complicit they were with the rise of Kronos, by making them promise to claim their children as soon as they reach the age of 13, or when they make it to Camp Half-Blood. So maybe demigods turned on Olympus because the gods were a bunch of deadbeats who left their children to fend for themselves, and that's if they were lucky to make it to Camp Half-Blood to begin with. With all that said, while Percy Jackson does a good job of representing kids with disabilities like dyslexia or ADHD, when it comes to other forms of diversity, it's kind of lacking. There are very few non-white characters in this series. There's Medusa, and she's poses as a Middle Eastern woman. And then there's one African-American, demigod. His name is Charles Beckendorf, and he's a son of Hephaestus, but then he's rarely mentioned, and then he dies in book 4. And then Ethan Nakamura, and he's an Asian kid who dies in book 5, and he was on this side of Kronos. Admittedly, Riordan gets better with this in his other series, but I just thought I should mention it because clearly it's something that Riordan took into consideration when he wrote his other books. So what are my concluding thoughts? Well, it's about the best you can ask for in a kid's book series, I would say. And it goes above and beyond in some parts, to be honest. That I think in many ways, the Percy Jackson series is worth the hype. Stamp of approval. Let's go. World building is still fun. The character work is phenomenal. And the action is very well written. I was still surprised at how well it still holds up. While the action adventure elements are what immediately catches the eye, especially for a young person, I feel the heart of the story is the interpersonal relationships, It's the friendships, it's, finding your identity, it's the complications of, family and, coming of age in a confusing world. Overall, it's a very light and fun story to read, and I honestly cannot wait for the Disney Plus show that's in development, because I feel this really deserves a better adaptation. That movie was horrible. Thank you. Like and subscribe.